Speaking of speeding things up, how is the startup time on Lucee these days? Because I know that was a goal that was set for Lucee 6 to speed it up when you're running in the cloud.
So,
ColdFusion Alive, the podcast for the ColdFusion community. Discover practices, tools, techniques, tips and trends for modern ColdFusion development. Brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. Develop, secure, optimize. Here is your host, the founder of TerraTech, Michaela Light.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Zac Spitzer from the Lucee Association Switzerland, along with some other organizations that I'll tell you about later. And we're going to be talking about some exciting breaking news about Lucee 6, all the features in that and when you can get your hands on it, and a bit about behind the scenes on what happens in Lucee and how you can best get support from the Lucee folks. Welcome, Zac.
glad to be here.
So if you don't know Zac, he's quite out there in all the forums, the Slack forum and the Facebook ColdFusion channel, because he is the community manager at Lucee Association Switzerland and helps with support and does a lot of other things we'll talk about in a moment, as well as being a senior software engineer at Razia and does a lot of work for DistroKid, which is one of the biggest ColdFusion sites in the world. So, as you will know, if you've listened to the Mark Drew episode about DistroKid, he's originally from Melbourne, Australia, but now is living in Berlin, Germany, and had a voice transplant so he could speak in a better accent than Australian. Just kidding. And he's been doing ColdFusion since 1996, back in the Alaire days, ColdFusion 2.0. So, thanks for coming on the show, Zac, and looking forward to hearing about what's going to be in Lucee 6.
So what's
the breaking news?
So the breaking news is we're finally going to do the first beta of Lucee 6 in July.
Woo! So
it's been a long time coming.
Where can people find that?
So we'll be doing, I'll be publishing it all over the web once we do that. We'll be publishing it online via the Lucee administrator, because with Lucee, unlike Adobe, you can just update your local Lucee server to Lucee 6. So we're maintaining compatibility with the old version of Lucee. So if you've got a Lucee 538 or 539 server, you can just go to the admin when it comes out and try it out.
Oh, cool. And so should we go to lucee.org or some other URL?
Yep, you can download at lucee.org, and you can download one of our existing installers, or you can use Commandbox. So we'll be starting publishing builds. We haven't published builds for the alpha releases of Lucee 6 because it's been a bit broken and we don't want to waste people's time. Even though lots of people have been super keen to try it, we wanted to reach a point where it was ready to go. So, yeah, in a couple of weeks, we will have the first beta version out there.
Excellent. How many alpha builds have you been through, Zac?
We're up to 106.0.0180 at the moment. So that's been a lot.
So 180 different builds. People have been trying it out inside the alpha community. But you're getting ready in a few weeks. And by the time this episode is released, I expect it will be released or soon available from lucee.org. And what is the cost for those who have been asleep for the last few years? What's the cost to use Lucee?
Nothing. You just need to be passionate.
All right. Sounds good to me. Of course, you can make donations to the Lucee Association, or you can get higher level support ticket contracts if you want to, or sponsor features. But yeah, for anyone who doesn't want to do that, they can get started with it for free. And I'm going to second that suggestion you had to use Commandbox to get going with Lucee, because that lets you get it up in minutes.
Absolutely.
And in addition, it lets you segregate different versions. So you could experiment with Lucee 6 while you're still running Lucee 5.3. So
Yeah, sponsorship is really important for the Lucee project. We have on Open Collective, we've got a place where you can go and become a sponsor. You can do a monthly subscription, a one-off donation. That actually supports us because Lucee is only as good as the support from the community. And I have to make a big shout out to all the people who work very hard to actually support the Lucee project. There's a lot of volunteers, people doing it out of passion, people who love CFML, they just want to go and fix things. And I love working on open source. It makes my heart shine because it's just fun and people want to make things better. It's one thing is code speaks louder than words. So it's, whether you go off and do testing and you find bugs and report them, or you go off and make suggestions, or you go off and say, this really shits me, I want to fix it, and go off and make a pull request to fix it. It all makes things better. That's why I got involved in Lucee, I think about 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. And then I started reporting bugs, and then I thought, well, maybe I can actually go and fix things myself.
Woo. And you've been fixing them ever since. So.
Yeah, the two things I firstly got involved with Lucee was one, because the Swiss lead developer is Bisha, who comes from Switzerland, and English is his second language, and he speaks pretty good English, but some of the error messages were a bit confusing in Lucee. So I spent a long time just going through the GitHub web interface, and if I ever got an error message I didn't quite understand, I'd go and make a pull request to actually improve the error message. And then And then at some point I decided, well, there's a Lucee docs project, and I went over and took that over. The guys from Pixel 8 started that, and it lets us auto-generate the docs from Lucee from the actual function and tag definitions in there. But it was really slow. And one thing I love doing in ColdFusion is performance tuning. So I went off and basically tamed that and made it run much faster, and I cleaned up a lot of bugs. And then now there's actually an interactive GUI editor. So if you want to go off and help contribute on the Lucee docs, you can just go and check out the repository, fire up command box, and bang, you can actually edit the docs interactively in your own web browser and then make a pull request.
Yeah. So that way the docs get updated a lot quicker than the Adobe docs. So
absolutely. And it's all about the for me, it's a case of when I go off and I'm a Lucee expert, but when I'm confused by something, then it's like, well, then it has to be improved. And that's the lovely thing about it, because as a developer, I love improving developer tooling, because we all battle with our computers every day. And if there's something which annoys me, well, maybe I can go and fix it and improve it. And that's one thing we did with Lucee 6 with the build process, which is a whole Java and process, which is quite foreign to most ColdFusion developers. But I started working with it and thought, this is a bit frustrating. I spent a long time making that really nice. So now when I'm working on the old 5.3 branch, I'm screaming. And then when I'm working on 6, it's like, oh, no, this is easy. So, yeah. Developers aren't lazy enough.
There you go. We need to be more lazy and have things work smoother. I just went to the docs.lucee.org site, which looks really cool these days. Will the beta docs for Lucee 6 appear on there, or are they going to be somewhere else, or what's the plan for the docs?
That's actually a very good question. We'll probably actually run up a beta site with that, with the Lucee 6 docs. At the moment, the doc site reflects the latest stable version of Lucee, but obviously with 6, there's a lot of stuff in there. However, every Lucee install has its own local documentation installed and built into the server. So Lucee docs reads the definition of all the tags and the functions and generates the static HTML, because Lucee Docs runs on CloudFront S3, but every Lucee install has got its own local documentation built into it. Okay.
And then for folks using an IDE like Sublime or VS Code, how would the tag insight or function insight get updated at some point, or what's the?
That will be.
I mean, if you're trying out new features, how do you know what the syntax is?
That's a good question. So everyone uses the Karma. What's the default plugin for VS Code? The Karma. One of those things. I never say the name of that plugin for VS Code out loud. I only read it.
Oh.
and that reads down CF docs. So we'll go and start contributing all those updates to CF docs. And yeah, it's a continual process. At some point, we also want to actually develop a round tripping of we can update the docs outside a release cycle on Lucee Docs, which is really important. But we don't actually round trip the updates and improvements sometimes from Lucee Docs directly back into the actual core of Lucee. So that's something we'd like to do, but it's an ongoing project.
Cool. So, at Lucee, you're the community manager, but what does that actually involve, Zac? What are you responsible for and do?
Okay, so to give you a bit of background, Lucee was written by Michael Light, who's a Swiss developer, a Java guru who knows. He's absolutely brilliant to work with. I started getting involved in Lucee about 6-7 years ago, and then a couple of years ago, Misha said to me, "Would you like to be the community manager?" Because I spend a lot of time reading all the commits and the blog posts and forum posts and stuff like that. And so my job is basically, I'm the single point of truth. I need to know everything going on. I need to know what your problems are, what if there are any regressions, what things we need to work on, and basically coordinate all of that sort of thing. Because we're a very small team, and I'd rather Misha spend time on a bug which I've gone off and triaged, got it already, I've got test cases and said, here's a problem to fix, than a Java developer going off and spending 2 days trying to work out why something doesn't work or what the problem is. So we work very well as a team there. So my job is to, like a good project manager, I insulate Misha from all of the day-to-day sort of stuff. I just come to him and say, here's a problem we need to fix. And then he can go and fix that. And it also means I'm there to help the community. People will post problems. For example, one of my favorite features in ColdFusion is Query of Queries, which Gert has mentioned previously, I think, on this podcast that he doesn't like, but Brad Wood and I love it. Brad from Order Solutions, we share the passion for Query of Queries, and we've, in the last 2 major releases of Lucee, have done a lot of work to increase the performance, the reliability, to make Query of Queries work like a traditional database and get rid of all the quirks, because anyone who's worked, especially with the Adobe version of it, it's quirky and it's annoying, whereas we've been trying to make it very boring, like a good database.
Cool. So you're also the build engineer, you triage the tickets, clean them up, and we'll talk about support a bit later in the show and how best to get Lucee support. But you're interfacing with people using Lucee and helping clarify the problems or solving the problems.
Sure.
And then you hand them over to Misha or someone else.
Being the build engineer, I mean, everyone will remember last year when the internet blew up in December and we had the Log4Shell vulnerability with Log4j. Now, fortunately, Lucee was still using an old version of Log4j, which wasn't vulnerable. But then we got a lot of feedback from all over our user base that we needed to address this. So then we started going down this path of actually updating to Log4j 2. And as part of that, I think everyone remembers Travis CI was very popular in the open source community up until last year, at which point they got taken over by venture capitalists or vulture capitalists, and then there was no more free tier. So I spent a long time migrating us to GitHub Actions. And then and then once we did that, we then realized when we were going through this Log4j stuff that we had a lot of interdependencies between Lucee extensions. So if you installed the S3 extension and the image extension, but the image extension needed a library which was actually loaded via the S3 extension, you could actually get problems. So then we have this thing called Lucee Light, which is basically Lucee with no extensions. And so our entire CI chain on all of our GitHub repositories now will actually go off and run the tests for Lucee, the S3 extension by itself with Lucee Light. That way you can mix and match, because we're all running Docker in the cloud these days, and we only want to run the extensions we need. So we basically had to go through and isolate all of these, test and isolate all of these extensions. And so as a build engineer, I was very happy when Log4Shell happened, because it was like, oh God, this is going to be terrible. But it's like, Actually, I've done the work, because before I was a programmer, I was a lighting designer for theatre and a stage manager. And your job there is to be invisible, okay? And every good developer is invisible. Your stuff just works, right? And so I did a hell of a lot of work getting the build infrastructure in place for Lucee, which then when Log4Shell happened, we could then leverage and actually then produce a stronger, better, safer, more secure version of Lucee. So,
excellent. So let's talk about some of the new features coming out in Lucee 6.
Okay. So the first big thing is we're moving to what's called a single context mode. So people familiar with Lucee, we have a hierarchical, Lucee and CFML, we have a hierarchical configuration level. So in Lucee 5.3, you've got a server context where you can set all your base configuration in there. Then for each website, you have a web context. And then inside each website, you have an application.cfc. And then the configuration is inherited from those three levels. However, having two contexts requires more memory, it requires more startup time, and it's more configuration, and it confuses people. Adobe traditionally has only had one configuration level, one context, which in the Docker environment makes a lot of sense. If you're running a server with 15 clients on it, then having this separated architecture is actually quite good, because you can separate your clients from each other. So in Lucee 6, we're going to have what's called a single context. So that will reduce the startup time for Lucee by half. It also means there's only one place to actually set your configuration. We're also moving from XML-based configuration, hello 1990s, over to JSON, which we're all familiar with, which means everyone who's doing Docker and CI are either using YAML or JSON these days. And every time you open up XML, it does feel kind of strange. So that's some of the big functionality changes in Lucee 6. The other thing we're doing, which is really important, is we're going to break some defaults in CFML. Because CFML has been around for coming up, almost 30 years now. And there are some defaults in CFML which we strive to maintain backwards compatibility, but at some point you have to say enough is enough. The CF location tag, everyone knows add token equals false. No, I don't want to send my session token to another URL on a foreign server just because I want to redirect that. So we're going to make that change to say that will no longer do that by default. There's quite a few other ones in there. We've flagged them all in the Lucee Jira as breaking changes. And to anyone listening, if there's anything you'd like to change, have a look and jump on the mailing list at dev.lucee.org and make proposals, because I love CFML that's been around for so long, but there are some dumb decisions which made sense in 1990, but in 2022 no longer make sense.
That makes sense to me. Just for the listeners, why is having CF location add token false important for security and other reasons? Because
the token is your login. So you log into my website as the administrator, okay? And then I go off and redirect you a CF location to another website. By default, CF location will pass your session token, which means I can then log back into my your website where you're an administrator using that session token. So your CFID.
Yeah, so it's a security hole for that default not to be the right way around.
Because ColdFusion is just so old that back in the day, cookies weren't reliable back then. That's why this was done.
Yeah.
And yeah, I cringe with horror when I think of it now, but back then it made sense.
So people listening, if you...
This podcast is brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. Develop, secure, optimize. Get detailed show notes on today's episode and your free CF Alive Modern ColdFusion Guide at terratech.com. That is TerraTech.com. And now back to today's show.
So people listening, if you have other suggestions on defaults that should be done better in the 2020s instead of the 1990s, let Zac know through the Lucee forum. What else is coming in Lucee 6?
So there's some very funky Java integration. So you'll be able to write a UDF, a function in Lucee, and then you can say type equals Java. And then instead of writing CFML, you can write Java code directly in your function. We're also adding in some auto wrapping of Java classes to make them more compatible with ColdFusion. And also, if you want to pass a CFML function into a Java function, we'll actually auto wrap that function so the Java function can accept that. So this is something quite new, and we'll be publishing some blog posts and demonstrations about that. We've also got...
So instead of having to go out and write a separate piece of Java code and then integrate it into the ColdFusion, you can just write it straight into your ColdFusion code, and it'll deal with all the, compiling it and hooking it into the ColdFusion.
Exactly, yeah. Because as you know, ColdFusion gets compiled in both Adobe and Lucee directly from ColdFusion down to bytecode. And so we're just going to step in the middle there and do some of those steps automatically.
Well, that makes it easier to reuse other people's Java code or write your own. If I'm remembering currently, you've got to build a jar file and then import it into ColdFusion to make calls to Java. Is that right? Or how are you?
It depends. It's still a pain point in there. Like one of the things about Lucee is we use OSGI, which is people might hear that bandied around, but everyone's familiar when if you go and drop a jar into your ColdFusion server and you want to go and update that jar, it's locked for the rest of the time you use it. Whereas with OSGI and Lucee, we can do the extension architecture where that will get loaded up dynamically and you can change it as you go. I still want to make Lucee more friendly with that. It's still not easy enough to use Java stuff in there. And that will be something we'll be focusing after the initial 6 release.
Okay, cool. What other things are you cooking up for version 6?
So what else have we got in version 6? How
about subcomponents?
Subcomponents, there you go. So one of the things which I love with the CFML community is try CF, because it's just wonderful to be able to go off there and sit in the web browser, type a bit of code and try it, and then try the different engines and see what works. But because ColdFusion is class-based but purely on files, you can't go off and create a demo for anything using CFCs on TryCF because it all has to be in a single file. So the idea is you'll be able to go and create a component within a file and then reference it within that file. How far we'll get with the initial 6 release, we'll have to see, but we've been working on that because I want to be able to demonstrate some of the more advanced functionality of ColdFusion like that.
Cool. And for folks who haven't been there, trycf.com is a website where you can just paste in code and see what it does. So handy thing to have in your toolbox. You mentioned query improvements. Can you tell that you've worked on with Brad Wood from Autis? Can you tell us a bit more about what you've done there?
Well, the main one was which we did with 538, which was we've increased the performance of the native query engine in Lucee dramatically. It's like almost a 10-fold improvement. This is what we call the native engine with queries of queries. It's only when you're working with a single table. We haven't got the join support. So what happens in Lucee, if you're doing a join between multiple tables, we'll actually load it up into HSQLDB and then execute the query in there, which is much slower. But when you're working with a single table, you want to do an aggregate function or some group bys or some data, it is blindingly fast. And then we're basically following the semantics of real databases because the old style of query support was very quirky. And we've basically just gone through there and found all of these situations where it wasn't performing the way we expected. What we're planning on doing and been talking about is actually exposing ColdFusion functions as database functions, SQL functions inside query of queries. So if you wanted to use a list function on a column inside a query, that's something we're talking about doing. So you might be able to go cf.list to array on a column name and actually then return in the query set this column as an array automatically.
Wow, that would be really cool. Now, my understanding of queries, I mean, in ColdFusion, a query is really just an array.
Yeah.
And query of queries is just an alternative way to language doing manipulations on arrays.
Mm-hmm.
That's one way to think of it. I mean, I know we think of it as we've got a query, that came back from a database, and now we're doing other things to the query. But, in reality, it's just manipulating that array of data. So using a language that programmers are used to from SQL. So very cool that you've speeded it up and you've made it work more like it's supposed to work.
Yeah, I mean, Brad's over in America. I'm here in Germany, and quite often I'll be sitting at home, and Brad will jump on CFML Slack and hit me up quite late at night, and I might have had a glass or two of red wine, and he's like, actually, which brings me to an anecdote. We had one where Brad was doing some work with TestBox, and he discovered that it was actually quite slow, spending a lot of time trying to convert numbers to doubles in Java, which is very expensive. And it was probably 11 o'clock at night. I'm like, oh, wait, okay, yeah. And we started looking into this, and then we broke out, I started load up the Lucee, and I was like hooked in with a step debugger and looking how it was working and stuff like that. And eventually we found out what Lucee was doing was, because with the argument scope, you can reference by name or positional index. So you can go user ID, see a function, user, ID. Okay, and you can reference that as arguments 1, arguments 2, or arguments user ID, arguments ID. And then what Lucee was doing was, it was actually going off and seeing when there was a variable name, it was trying to convert it when it was doing the scope cascading, when it starts in local scope and then it goes into the argument scope and goes up and up. It was saying, can I convert this name into a number to see if it's a positional argument for the argument scope? Right?
Okay.
Which is really complex to actually explain to everyone. Goes like, huh, what? And it took me, I came up with the idea, and Brad's like, what? I don't understand. And then we sat there for a while, and eventually Brad's like, ding, totally, he understands. We don't need to try to convert, because in TestBox you have the expect syntax. And Lucee was saying, oh, it's got an E, it could be an exponential number, and it was trying to convert expect into an exponential number to see if it was an argument scope. But a number isn't a valid variable name in CFML. So it was redundant, but it was doing this every single time. And through this one change, which I had to then explain to 5 people and took about half an hour each time until they went like, oh, that makes sense. We sped up the Lucee test cycle by 12% with one change.
Oh, cool. That's excellent. Speaking of speeding things up, how is the startup time on Lucee these days? Because I know that was a goal that was set for Lucee 6 to speed it up when you're running in the cloud. So having a single context instead of 2 contexts means that we've actually got half the time for startup and less memory involved. We've also got a lot of historical flash like things in Lucee. And so when you deploy Lucee for the first time, it goes and deploys what's called the context, which is the webint folder, which people might know. Now, anyone who's with Lucee 6, we're going to move the webint folder out of the web root. Okay, by default, Lucee deploys the webint folder inside the web root, and there's a lot of information there, and there's nothing which needs to be under the web root. And there's I'll post a link up later about how to do this, but you can configure Lucee to put all of your webint folders outside the web root, which makes your server more secure by default. But when Lucee starts up, especially the first time, it has to deploy all this sort of stuff. So there was all these there was a Swift file, there's a JavaScript file to actually display the Swift Flash for applet and stuff like that, and stuff to do CF applet. We've got rid of all that sort of stuff, which Pete Freitag, he does the what's his Lambda stuff for AWS? The Fuseless. Yeah, Fuseless. He uses it for his Fixinator product.
Yeah, and he basically said, like, why are we deploying all this old stuff? Because it just takes time. It needs to start up and use as less memory as possible. So we've cut out a lot of this old craft, which will make it actually deploy quicker. Lucee does have a built-in functionality if you're doing a warm-up. So if you're creating a Docker image, which you're going to then deploy into production multiple times, you can actually run Lucee with environment variable Lucee warm enable, I think, equals 1. And Lucee will fire up, deploy all those extensions, create the directory structure, and then exit. So the next time it's like it's already been installed, you can actually save a couple of seconds. So if you're deploying on demand, suddenly Elon Musk has tweeted out your ColdFusion website and you're getting a lot of traffic, bang, suddenly you can deploy a lot quicker with that. So we've been working on streamlining this sort of thing. We've also been trying to improve the way extensions get deployed with Lucee 6. So that firstly, the logging is much more detailed. I'm a big fan of logging because things should fail fast, fail early, and explain why. And a lot of the time, it can be a little bit of a mystery. Big tip for everyone at home, Lucee by default sets all the error logs to error. All the log levels by default to error. The deploy log has got great information. When you update Lucee, you install an extension, or you're using the Maven integration where you create a Java object and it downloads from Maven a Java object from the update provided from Lucee. That gets logged to the deploy log, but only when you set log level to info. With log level error, it only records errors. So anyone struggling with installing extensions, it's a good tip.
That is a great tip. So tell us a bit more about serverless deployment, because that's what's happening with Lambda that Pete's doing with his fuseless.
Well, that's a big space up there. I know that Cloudflare are big fans of that as well, and AWS. My goal is basically to actually strip down Lucee as much as possible. To actually make that better, because it's all about starting up as fast as possible and using as least memory as possible. So it's something we're striving for 6, and I'm looking forward to sort of haven't chatted with Pete in a while. I'm looking forward to seeing his feedback once we actually get that out there. There's also Project Loom coming up, which is we don't support Java 17 yet with Lucee, but Project Loom is switching from, because Lucee enables threads out of the box, has very powerful threaded support. So if you're doing a query each, for example, you can pass in arguments saying parallel and max threads equals 4, and it'll process through your query using 4 threads. The problem is up to Java, so this is Java 19, I think, Project Loom, they're operating system threads. So there's an overhead for being multi-threaded. Project Loom then uses lightweight threads within the JVM, so that with using parallel stuff in Lucee, if you're doing parallel on very small operations, there's more time spent creating the thread than actually doing the work, and diminishing returns. With Project Loom, you can spin up 1 million threads if you want to, and it won't actually kill your server, and it'll actually do this sort of processing. So there's some nice stuff from Java coming through too, which will benefit Lucee out of the box. I can't hear you.
My fault.
Okay.
So what happened with Hibernate? Have you guys upgraded onto the latest version of Hibernate, or?
So the team at Audis, who are big fans of ORM, came to us because most of the Lucee team doesn't do much Hibernate sort of stuff. We're sort of more bare bones kind of. We like to do direct SQL. Anyway, they sponsored us to do an upgrade of the Hibernate engine. So we firstly fixed the existing 3.55, which is bundled with Lucee 5.3. And then we also then went off and did an upgrade to Hibernate 5.4, which will be the default engine with Lucee 6. And there's support for Hibernate events. You can now I think there's one outstanding bug, but you can actually mix Hibernate and traditional CF query within a transaction. So for a long time, it was a bit rough in Lucee with Hibernate, but the latest release is actually much more stable, and the guys at Audis are quite happy.
Well, that's good. Yeah, we use ORM in some of our projects, so good to hear you speeded that up. Any other things in Lucee 6 we should be aware of?
There's quite a few little performance improvements in there. There's some more additional functionality which matching some of the Adobe stuff in there. What else? I'm just trying to think. There's actually a lot in there with 180 releases, snapshots so far. Yeah, we're moving to the JSON-based configuration. We also added in with Lucee 539 the ability to actually import a JSON configuration file, a bit like you can do with the Autis CF-config tool, but you can do that natively in Lucee. There's also, we have everyone knows about the server.cfc, which runs when you start up your ColdFusion server. We've added a web.cfc, so when you start up a website, a web context, you can actually load configuration at that point as well. There's some more listeners being added in Lucee 6. So some of these are already in the 5.3, but we have query listeners, mail listeners. One of the things we're looking at doing is adding in for CF HTTP, we're adding in a progress listener. So if you're going and downloading a big file from a remote server, you can actually then give a bit of feedback to your users to say something's being downloaded.
That is cool.
Yeah.
Seeing as sometimes these remote calls kind of die.
What's going on? I mean, one thing we added in with Lucee 538, we added in some logging for CF location, because we have having problems at DistroKid that we have a lot of CF locations and we didn't know when they were happening. So there's a trace log in Lucee, and if you set the level to info for that, it'll actually log with a stack trace, a CFML stack trace, where all of your CF location calls. And then for 539, we did the same for CF HTTP. So if you've got a server, you don't know what it's doing, it's downloading stuff in the background, how long it's taking, that will now actually log all that information out to the trace log. I also love debugging. Like debugging and logging are two of my favorite things, because what the hell's going on? I want to find out. And I've done a lot of work with Misha to actually improve the debugging experience, so the debug logs. I've got two admin extensions for Lucee, which I wrote. One's called a log viewer, which gives you a aggregated log view, because Lucee has, I think, 10, 15 log files by default. And I wrote a log viewer which reads all those log files and presents them color-coded with a view, color-coded in line with the stack traces abbreviated, so you can see what's going on there. And the second one is the performance analyzer. And what the performance analyzer lets you do is you can go and enable debugging on your Lucee server, let it run for a while. Then you can open up my performance analyzer, and it'll give you, normally when you see the debug logs from ColdFusion, which is one of the things I love about ColdFusion, is you go off and open a page, look at debug logs, you can see what queries being run, what took long, what took slow, all this sort of stuff. But with my performance analyzer, we then go and say, okay, take these 1,000 debug logs, rather than looking at them horizontally, let's look at them vertically. So out of this load I run on my server, what's my slowest function? What's my slowest query? And it lets you look at that as a summary across the server.
Wow, cool.
And then for Lucee 6, this is good. I'm actually remembering. I've done so much stuff in Lucee 6, I've forgotten, to be honest. One of the things in Lucee 6 is you can actually enable thread debugging. So if you go off and start doing stuff with CF thread, or you do array each, or any of the parallel functionality, anything which happens inside those threads doesn't show up in debugging. In Lucee 6, you can turn that on, and you can see the performance of what happens inside each thread run.
That is excellent. If we want to try out the admin log viewer, where would we find that?
If you go to my GitHub profile, You can see links for all of that. It's
okay.
github.com/Zac Spitzer, and they're both on ForgeBox.
All right. Excellent.
So we used that recently. I was working with Mark Drew, and we wanted to improve the overall speed of distrokid.com. And because over the years, people have been adding a lot of different stuff in there, and it got a little bit slower on the initial response time. And so I said, let's go off and do this. So we went off and ran some load testing with 5,000 requests with debug enabled. We then went off and fired up my performance analyzer. We sat there and said, here's all the low-lying fruit. And we managed to get, I think we reduced the time by a factor of 5 or 7 in there, because you get this view on what's going on there. So, and it'll also show you all the active threads, what's running on your server. You can see a summary of the exceptions and all that sort of stuff in there. So it's like I won't say it's a poor man's Fusion reactor, but it actually gives you a lot of very valuable information in there.
I was just thinking, how does this compare to Fusion Reactor? It probably has much fewer features, but gives you some basics for free.
I think you can get up to speed with mine a lot quicker. Fusion Reactor, you do need to go off and watch a few videos or have someone like Brad or Charlie come in and teach you how to use it. With mine, you can actually go in there and drill down. I did a lot of work with the guys from Pixel 8 with their CMS. I was working on that for a client project, and I was like, this seems to be a bit slow in a few places. So I ended up doing a lot of work on my performance analyzer to actually expose some of the underlying problems we had in there. Then, like anything in programming, 90% of the problem is actually finding the problem. Once you know the problem, solving it is quite easy. So
cool. And then I remember a few years back at CF Camp, I think it was Gert who announced what was coming in Lucee 6, but not everything will be in this initial 6.0 release. Mm-hmm. So I just want to mention some of the things that are will be possibly coming in future releases, futures and promises in the code, that might be coming, lockdown settings for the administrator. Mm-hmm. Feel free to interrupt and yap about it.
No, you're doing well.
Disguising that Lucee is the application server for security purposes. Individual CF tokens or CFID names.
That's something getting rid of the CFID as a default hardwired token name is something which is quite dear to my heart. But it's one of those. Part of the difficulty with my role is that on one hand I have to be there to help all the other developers in the team do stuff, but then for me to go off and say I'm going to spend next 3 weeks of my Lucee time doing this pull request, I don't have time to do that. But I'd love to actually get rid of the CFID tokens. And make that configurable.
There you go. Also, there was talk of a password vault, quarantine mode. We wrote a bit about that in an article on Lucee 6. So
one of the things which is a little bit of a hidden function in the Redis extension for Lucee, there's a tag called CF distributed lock, which is like CF lock, but rather than working on your local server, it works across a cluster via a Redis server. So if you're doing processing on multiple servers and you want to lock certain records in a database or certain files, you can use this CF distributed lock tag to then actually do cluster-aware locking.
Wow, I didn't know about that. So but that's already existing in Lucee 5, right?
Yeah, that's part of the Redis extension, and we use that quite heavily at DistroKid.
Okay. And then also you're looking at a default log appender, which will be fallback.
Yeah, I mean, my holy grail is actually to change the way logging is configured in Lucee. So we have this lovely, for example, a data source logging. We also have a Datadog appender. And I would like to be able to configure. We have 10, 15 different basic log types in Lucee. I would like to be able to say, I want to send all my logs to a text file or to Datadog or to a data source. And then all I do per log file is to say this log file level error, this one level info, no other information. Because at the moment there's a lot of the configuration is a pain in the bum, and it should be much more high level. So you have a global log configuration, and all the individual log files inherit from that.
Well, that would be exciting. And then I also read, there was the thought of having event-driven architecture in Lucee.
Yeah, there was something like, remember the Mac 2, that framework? It's always funny actually talking about the names of frameworks. Like Nginx, for example, is something which I'd read so many times, but I've been working as a solo developer for many years, never actually read all these terms and never actually spoken them out. And then suddenly it's like, oh, how do I say that? Like people laugh at me because I'm Australian, so we don't say, we say caching, not caching. And every time that Australians go on a podcast, they talk about caching, and everyone's like, what? Oh, you Australians?
Well, I can understand that totally. I've had the same problem in my life. And then also there was talk about adding new native support for Java streams. I don't know whether that's still going to happen or is in the future.
That's on the future. Louis has done a lot of work with CB streams over at Autis, and I think he sort of jumped the gun a little bit on that one and already implemented stuff. So we like to focus on keeping it simple. We don't want to actually add too much to the Lucee core, so we'll see what happens with that. I'm more interested in making working with Java libraries a bit more easier, because I still get a bit stumped myself because I'm not a Java developer. I know a lot about Lucee and how that all ties together, but I think that working with Java libraries is still a bit too painful in Lucee. So that's probably what I'm going to be advocating. And in my role as community manager, I think Misha will listen to me.
Well, and there are a lot of really cool Java libraries out there, but because they're kind of hard to use, I mean, it's quite possible to use them from ColdFusion, and we've done it. For, like we did one for a PowerPoint integration where we had to churn out PowerPoints out of ColdFusion, and we found a Java library that did it, and we got it to do it, but it was a bit of a pain in the butt. This was about 15 years ago, so maybe it's easier now. But you're going to make it super easy for all ColdFusion developers. If they see something really nice in a Java library, they can run it in Lucee.
That's the goal, because we love Lucee and we love CFML, there's this ongoing thing: is CFML dead? But as you guys were talking about that, there's a programming index, the TOB index of programming languages, and apparently, was it 10, 15 years ago, there was an argument: is CFML a programming language, or is it or something like that? And that's why you don't see ColdFusion on that list.
Oh. Have they actually tried programming it? These people who think it isn't a programming language, have they actually looked at the latest Lucee or the latest Adobe ColdFusion and seen all the cool stuff that's in it? They were probably looking at 1995 ColdFusion code,
I had a nice, a couple of months ago, I had a guy from NASA reach out to me on LinkedIn, because NASA is a Lucee user. The Mars Curiosity website was all powered by Lucee, which I already knew, but then this guy from NASA reached out and said, hey, we need to know about accessibility, because you're part of our standard platform of software, which we offer to our different teams and stuff like that, but we need to know about accessibility. And I was, my inner child was like, oh my God, NASA, woohoo!
Yes, and, maybe you get a free trip on one of their rockets, you never know. Or at least get to visit them in whatever NASA location they're in.
Well, I watched the first episode of All for Mankind last week for the third season, and they had the first space hotel, which didn't end up very well. So I'm quite happy on Earth at the moment, but I love the idea.
All right. Let's talk a bit about the Lucee release cycles, because I'm a bit confused about it. I had a talk on the podcast with Patrick Quinn when he was in charge of that. And he was doing like a monthly release cycle, but that doesn't seem to be what you guys are doing right now. Can you tell us what you're doing and why?
So number one rule is that we don't want to have regressions. Okay, we want to be moving forward and not actually break things, because previously we'd have Lucee releases where there'd be all this new great stuff, but then something else would be broken. Okay, and so 5.3.8, which was famously a very long release, was because Misha 538.80 said, let's release it. I said, no, there's regressions. And that ended up being, I think we're at 538.224 at the moment. My philosophy as a developer, like I was saying about being involved in the theatre, is we shouldn't be visible. So what we strive to with Lucee is to actually make stable releases. I know that the monthly release cycle makes no sense because you don't have time with your clients and your projects to go off and basically every month do a testing cycle, release cycle, all that sort of stuff. At the moment, I would like to see a shorter release cycle, but I'm thinking 3 to 6 monthly release cycles is probably more like the 6-month release cycle is probably the best, because no one's got time to go off and do all the testing. We have some amazing people who do testing with Lucee. It's really wonderful, but a lot of people don't have time. And then we go off and make a release. They go off and test it. After we release a stable version, they say, it's broken, it doesn't work. I'm like, we've been in two release candidates and you haven't bothered to test it. And now you're telling us a week after we've released it doesn't work?
Maybe that's something to look at in the future, because I know Adobe has like a big library of customer supplied code. They just run their releases through to make sure they don't have these regressions where the new release breaks old code. And so that's possibly an idea for Lucee, that you get customers to give you a copy under NDA of their code, and you just run the stuff through it and make sure it doesn't break.
We've been talking about setting up, especially with like Autis and Pixelate, the people who are doing sort of big public frameworks and stuff like that, of actually setting up a distributed workflow so that we won't do it on every single build of Lucee, but being able to go from the Lucee repo and say, go off and run distributed tests. You go and trigger running a test with the latest build of Lucee on all these different platforms, and then getting results back to say, you've broken something or it works. And then also monitoring performance. And that's something which we want to get in place with the rest of the community. But
that would be excellent if you could do that. I mean, I remember the Adobe ColdFusion 5 release, which was a total cluster F.
Worse than 6?
Or maybe I mean 6. No, I got it wrong. You're right. 6. Yeah, it's when they moved from C code. It used to be coded in C, and then they moved to Java, and the whole thing was broken. Yeah. And I do remember talking with Damian Cooper, probably at CF Summit, and he basically set up these, much more, whatever the word is, formal testing and having copies of
rigorous
code. So. Rigorous, that's the word we're looking for. And I think it makes sense because you want people to trust Lucee, and when they get a release, it's gonna, you expect it to work. So.
It's something I really want to do, and I have the domain knowledge to actually facilitate that. But there's only one Zac in the world. And,
we need to clone you.
I want more people to get involved, because it's actually fun doing this sort of stuff. And
how can people get involved? What would you recommend?
Well, it's like, how did I get started with Lucee? I found a problem and I said I want to solve it. Right. So if someone says I love the idea of setting up distributed testing for Lucee, or something doesn't work, just jump on the mailing list, hit me up on Slack. I'm there to help. A lot of people reach out and say they want to help. It doesn't go anywhere, but I'm always there to actually help. I'm trying to actually document all this sort of stuff. I did a lot of work with Lucee Build. People who want to do Java development. It's 10 times easier to do it today than it was when I first started. And so, pick stuff like, Ben says he doesn't have time to actually write documentation, stuff like that, but Ben is one of the saints of the community. His blog posts are the gold standard, and his passion for CFML is great. But if like I said, code speaks louder than words. If you find a mistake in documentation, don't tell me, send me a pull request.
Okay, well, that's a good suggestion. For folks listening, that's Ben Nadell we're talking about, not any other Bens that might be in the ColdFusion world. Now, one question, I'm a little confused here, because you've had a lot of point releases in version 5. And when you said that you want to have a 3 to 6 month release cycle, do you mean for point releases, or do you mean for full release?
Yes, it's kind of so you could pretty much argue that 538 was actually the equivalent of Adobe 2021 annual release kind of thing at the moment. So there is a little bit of, I'm thinking once we go to Lucee 6, we'll probably do less point releases and then jump to a next version up there. One of the things in Lucee is we have this backwards compatibility with what's called our loader. So this is why you can still go and install the latest 5.39.141 stable release on a Rallyo install of 4.5 and it will run. That's what's called the loader interface in there. But yeah, we need to revisit the way we actually do our version numbering at the moment. I quite agree with that, because before we do the beta for 6, we're going to release the third and hopefully final stable release for 5.3.9, because there's a few regressions and regressions get fixed. And then we're going to do 5.3.10 in the meantime, because 5.3 is what we call an LTS release. Okay, we're going to maintain that with bug fixes and security fixes for the next couple of years. Like similar with Ubuntu, where they have their stable releases in there, and then 6 will move faster. And at some point, we'll then pick the next version with an LTS release. Because a long time people got stuck on older versions of Lucee because there were regressions. And they go, I can't upgrade because of this. And it's like, well, that sucks. And so now we've been trying to do that. And as one of the project managers for Chrome used to say to me, Zac, when you find bugs in Chrome, they're usually pretty good. You have to keep on screaming. I once found a bug in Chrome that the geolocation on Google Maps stopped working in Australia at 2 o'clock in the afternoon until 6 p.m. because it was 6 a.m. in Mountain View, California, at which point Chrome got so successful that it exceeded their own internal license for Google Maps geolocation API, and they were all asleep. They wake up, it didn't work, so they didn't know the problem was there. And so if there's a regression in Lucee which is bugging you or stopping upgrading, let me know. You know, my email is Zac. If you're working for a company where you can't say it publicly, you can send me an email at zac@lucee.org. I want to hear people's pain problems, because at the end of the day, I love Lucee and I want to make everyone's life easier, not harder with it.
All right. So let's finally talk about how people, you know, if they need support on Lucee, what's the best approach for that? Where should they start off?
So the best place is probably CFML. Or firstly, Google. Look up your problem, because there's a lot of on the Lucee mailing list. There's a lot of information. CFML Slack, like was discussed on the last podcast, is a bit of a black hole because there's only a 5 gig limit, so you can't find stuff. That's why I always say post your problems on the mailing list, because then they'll get answered and you can help someone else.
Now, when you say the mailing list, I think you mean the forum online at dev.lucee.org, which also echoes out to a mailing list.
I've got grey hair on my beard, all right? That's why I say mailing list.
Oh, okay. And the great thing about that is it's searchable by Google. So once people have posted an issue in there, other people can find it easily. So first, do a Google search for your issue, see if you can find if someone else has done it. If not, post into the dev forum for Lucee.
Yeah, and then explain what you've actually looked and done it, because we're developers, but some developers are their own worst enemies. Okay, so we have a template on the forum saying what database you're using, what Java version you're using, which Lucee version you're using, which extension. Okay, you basically got to writing a bug report is an art form. Okay, there are some people out there who write, it's broken, it doesn't work. And I'm like, what doesn't work? What are you trying to do? You know, and if you go through this process of saying, when you go and ask for support, you ask, how would I answer this? If a client comes to me and says, this is my problem, you're going to go, do I have enough information to answer this problem? And then sometimes people do that. They'll write really nice reports, and then they're like, okay, I'm just going to pick one phrase from your error message there. I'm going to search that on Google, and the first result explains it. And it's like, look up, it's an important process for people to learn in there. I mean, I love doing support for people because sometimes it's mind-numbing and silly and you have to sort of extract, water from the stone. And other times people have found some really quirky bugs which are great fun to investigate. So, yeah, I work for Razia, and Razia are heavily involved with and sponsor the Lucee Association Switzerland. So if you need commercial support, I'll put my hat on and say you can contact razia.ch or IO, and we are the Lucee experts. If you want also any functionality added in there, your business says we really need something in there, it's something which Razia can do. But there's also great support on the mailing list. Don't hit me up on Twitter. Do not hit me up privately on CFM or Slack with a DM. If you want personal support, then you can contact Gert at Razia, and he's and you can engage me with that. But private support, I don't do. That's a rule of mine.
Oh, makes sense. I mean, you're doing all this stuff on the forum. It helps other people who have the same issue. They can search it and find it. So I could see how it could be easy to get overwhelmed if everyone was hitting you up privately, and it doesn't really help the community to do it privately. So,
I mean, the other great thing to do is writing test cases. So we use Testbox for Lucee. So if there's functionality, you find something doesn't work, we have a great team who often produces test cases. But if you want to get involved with Lucee, you can go and have a look at some test cases and go and add them in. I'm really open to helping people get involved in the Lucee project. It's part of my role. And because, I mean, also the Lucee Docs has got a lot of very old content which goes back 5, 10, 15 years, or 10, 50. I feel old. And we could probably actually get rid of a lot of that old content. It's talking about, Ubuntu 14 or, stuff like that, or Tomcat 7.
Yeah, it could be archived out. I mean, I guess in theory, someone might be using that. But generally, when I've done surveys in our State of the ColdFusion user survey, most people who use Lucee are on the latest release or maybe the one prior. It's not like Adobe ColdFusion where you find still people using stuff from 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. Because, there's no financial reason not to upgrade. It's just, hey, you've got to retest your code when you upgrade to a new version of Lucee.
Which actually, coming back to the support question, we do have people going like, I'm using this old version of Lucee, something doesn't work. I'm like, have you tried the latest version yet?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, so if you've got a problem with Lucee, the first thing is like, go and try updating your Java, trying out latest release. Okay. Mm-hmm. And if it works the latest release,
which you can do easily using command box, right? It's not like, I mean, I talk to CIOs. I talk to CIOs, pretty regularly every week. And when someone tells me, I'm using a version of Lucee from 3 years ago, it's like, first of all, why would you cause that kind of technical debt? Why would you not just update it when it's easy and free to do? Particularly now you've shared that you work really hard to make sure the new releases don't break old stuff. Mm-hmm. And secondly, if you use command box, you can just spin up the latest version of Lucee, check your code runs okay before you put it out onto your staging server and then production server. So
it's crazy if you got your developers battling an old version of Lucee, which is 3 years old, and since then there's been 3 years of work to make it more streamlined and things actually work. So, you have developers spending 3 days trying to fix a bug which we've already fixed. It's a total waste of time.
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone listening, make sure your Lucee's up to date and, go through a process, but also, try out. Don't just
test release candidates. Okay. When we give out release candidates, go and test them, because
then you'll know your code will work on the final gold release that gets put out of Lucee 6. You get to the front of the queue that way, because I know during beta cycles, generally companies are keen to fix those issues, reported during the beta cycle. So,
and it's also, if you go and get involved in the beta cycles, and sometimes it's great just to actually post and say, test it out with my application, all works fine, because sometimes we go off and do all this work and we don't hear anything back from people, and just actually saying, hey, thanks, it's all working, is great. And then when you actually have another problem, and if you're getting involved in the Lucee project, I'm much more likely to dive in there and really help you a lot more if you're actually contributing yourself to the project. Then you have my full attention. If you're just someone who sits there and says, it doesn't work, it's like, yeah, sure, I'll help you. But if you're someone who's updating some docs or doing testing and stuff like that, you'll get a lot better response from people.
Yeah, it's a secret way to get to the front of the support queue. So,
and
great tip.
It's fun. I like finding bugs and solving them.
There you go. So, as we wrap up this episode, tell us, Zac, why are you proud to use ColdFusion?
Because I like building things with. Ironically, I love all the nuts and bolts of actually making Lucee actually work. But I actually like being able to use Lucee like a singer uses a microphone. Okay, because Lucee lets me abstract away all this low-level sort of stuff, and I can just focus on what I'm doing. And DistroKid, it's great. We've got a big team of developers in there, and people just go off and do all sorts of stuff. As Gert was saying last week, we have a new developer at DistroKid, Hi Hudson, who started a month ago, and he's been so productive within 1 month because he just basically can sit there. He's picked up it all. I spent my time onboarding, because onboarding developers, you have to invest time in bringing people on board. And I think a lot of companies kind of miss that, especially with remote work. But what I love about ColdFusion is it lets me focus on what I want to do, not as opposed to, framework hell, or, I'm glad I'm not doing front end anymore. The framework wars, or, we got to new version of React, have to throw the baby out with the bathwater and upgrade and all that sort of stuff. Whereas, Lucee code from ColdFusion code from 20 years ago still runs. I get messages from people sometimes say, hey, you've done a great job with Lucee. I've upgraded a ColdFusion 8 app to Lucee 5.3.9 and it just worked.
Wow. That is a great update to do. I would not run any code in ColdFusion 8, not because there's anything wrong with the technology. It's just it doesn't get security patches for the last 10 years or whatever the end of life was on ColdFusion 8. But
ColdFusion 8 was a great release.
Yeah, it was. We talked a bit earlier about how occasionally people say ColdFusion is dying, which I think is a bunch of BS. But my question to you, Zac, is what would it take to make ColdFusion more alive this year?
This is a catch-22 for me. I would love to go to some conferences. My last ColdFusion conference was MX Down Under in Sydney, 2006, MXDU. So that's 16 years ago. We're going to do a CF camp over here on the Europe side of things quite soon. But like I was talking about with Hudson, go out there and if you're a senior ColdFusion developer, go and start teaching some people. Go and grab some young, sprightly kids out there and show them how easy it is to go off and say, I've got a Postgres database, I want to pull some data out and export it to JSON, and show them how they can do that and share the joy and the simplicity of it, because ColdFusion's a lovely abstraction. Sorry, Adobe, but what you've done with 2021 with all of your add-ins and stuff, Lucee has been doing that for a long time. Extensions and Lucee most of the time just work and it's easy. With Adobe, it's still too complicated. But the joy of being able to just get something up and running and then start programming and doing what you want to do as opposed to battling the platform, I think that's great. That's what I love about CFML.
Excellent. Well, if folks want to find you online, what are the best ways to do that?
So I'm obviously on the Lucee Dev forum, dev.lucee.org. Also on Twitter, I'm quite actively tweeting under the Lucee and CFML hashtags at Zackster, Zackster. Or on GitHub, you can follow me on Zac Spitzer on there, and you'll see my name all over the Lucee repos.
Oh, excellent. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show today, Zac. I know it's getting rather late there in Germany where you are, so I hope you have a fabulous...
It's summer here, so it's still daylight.
Oh, of course. That's why it's still light. There you go. Yeah, midsummer. And beautiful time to be in Berlin. It's a wonderful city. So, all right. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show.
This has been great fun.
Get deep detailed show notes on today's episode and your free CF Alive Modern ColdFusion Guide at teratech.com. That is teratech.com. Viva la CF Alive Revolution!